1870 to 1952. Maria Montessori, influenced by Edward Seguin's teaching methods, becomes a pioneer in teaching children with and without disabilities. 1871. Population of the Pennsylvania Training School reaches 185. 1872. Alexander Graham Bell opens speech school for teachers of deaf students in Boston. 1876. The Association of Medical Officers of American Institutions for Idiotic and Feeble-Minded Persons is founded. Edward Seguin is the first president. 1880. The National Association of the Deaf is founded. 1882. Institution in Syracuse, New York opens farm colonies. 1883. Francis Galton, a cousin to Charles Darwin, coins the term eugenics. 1887. Woman admitted to the National Deaf-Mute College, now Gallaudet. 1888. Maryland opens the Asylum and Training School for the Feeble-Minded. Late 1880s Pennsylvania adds a girls' cottage for 80 women of childbearing age. 1889. Laura Bridgman, world-famous blind student of the Perkins School, dies at age 60 of pneumonia. 1892. Ellis Island opens. 1894. National Deaf-Mute College becomes Gallaudet College. 1896. Charles Eliot Norton, editor of the North American Review, advocates for the painless destruction of insane and deficient minds. 1897. Martin Barr discusses benefits of desexualization at the Association for Medical Officers of American Institutions for Idiotic and Feeble-Minded Persons. 1899. Boston starts special education classes. Teachers are sent to Massachusetts Institution for the Feeble-Minded at Waltham and Elwyn Institute in Pennsylvania for training. 1900. Sigmund Freud publishes The Interpretation of Dreams. 1901. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania starts special education classes. 1903. U.S. Congress bars immigration of epileptics. 1904. Martin Barr publishes Mental Defectives. 1906. Rome State Custodial Asylum for Unteachable Idiots in New York opens a farm colony, the Brush Colony. Research department at the training school in Finland, New Jersey is begun. Henry H. Goddard is hired to head the laboratory. 1907. Indiana passes sterilization law. 1909. Gunnar Dibwad, grandfather of the self-advocacy movement, is born in Germany. Clifford Beers, a young businessman who had a mental breakdown and recovered, writes about it in A Mind That Found Itself. 1910. Letchworth Village, an institution for the feeble-minded, opens in New York. 1911. New Jersey legislature authorizes statewide special education classes and mandates eugenic sterilization for certain categories of adult feeble-minded. Henry H. Goddard publishes The Kallikak Family. Davenport and Florence H. Danielson publish The Hill Folk. 1913. Wisconsin legislature authorizes sterilization to stop the breeding of mental defectives. 1915. Operating expenditures at the Rome State Custodial Asylum for Unteachable Idiots for fiscal year equals $228,893, or $12.81 per inmate per month. 1916. Terman revises the Binet test and introduces the term intelligence quotient, or IQ. 1917. Charles Bernstein at Rome State Custodial Asylum opens first colony for females working in factories. Henry H. Goddard presents data that 40 to 50% of immigrants are feeble-minded. U.S. Congress declares war with Germany and enters into World War I. 1918. New York's sterilization law is found to be unconstitutional. 1921. The American Foundation for the Blind, or AFB, a non-profit organization recognized as Helen Keller's cause in the United States, is founded. 1924. Congress passes the Immigration Restriction Act. 1926. Arthur H. Estabrook and Ivan E. McDougall publish Mongrel Virginians, the Wynn Tribe. 1927. Buck v. Bell, Supreme Court case that permits sterilizations. 1930. Harvey M. Watkins' questionnaire of 317 members of the American Association on Mental Deficiency finds that 80% favor sterilizations. 1931. 27 states have enacted sterilization laws. 1933. Germany enacts the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring, permitting forced sterilization for people with perceived genetic disabilities, such as epilepsy, schizophrenia, manic depression, deafness, congenital feeble-mindedness, Huntington's chorea, and blindness. 1934. Third Reich begins sterilization of Germans. 1935. The League for the Physically Handicapped forms to protest discrimination by the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. 1936. The Children's Benevolent League organizes, later known as the Washington Association for Retarded Children. 1938. The March of Dimes begins treatment centers and fundraising for children and adults with polio. 1939. Dr. Foster Kennedy, head of the Euthanasia Society of America, urges legalizing euthanasia for, quote, born defectives who are doomed to remain defective. Hitler commences Action T4 mercy killing program of the sick and disabled. 1941. U.S. Congress declares war with Japan and enters into World War II. 1942. The population of Rome State School reaches 3,940, with 1,000 living in colonies. 1945. World War II ends. Nazis had murdered 18 to 26 million people in death camps. 2,000 paraplegic soldiers survived the Second World War, compared with only 400 from World War I. 1947. Parents discuss forming a national advocacy organization during an AAMD conference in St. Paul, Minnesota. 1948. The General Assembly of the United Nations adopts the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The United Cerebral Palsy Association is founded. 1950. The National Association for Retarded Children is formed. The Muscular Dystrophy Association is founded. 1953. Ed Roberts, father of the independent living movement, contracts polio. 1964. Ed Roberts enrolls at the University of California, Berkeley. 1965. Robert F. Kennedy attacks the Rome and Willowbrook state schools in New York for appalling conditions. Civil rights marches in Selma, Alabama. The Voting Rights Bill becomes law, nullifying local laws and practices that prevent minorities from voting. Malcolm X is assassinated on February 21st. 1955. The Montgomery Bus Boycott. 1956. Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Court ruling that separate but equal segregated schools violate the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. 1957. Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, is founded to coordinate localized Southern efforts to fight for civil rights. 1960. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, is formed in Raleigh, North Carolina, by a group of Shaw University students. The Greensboro sit-ins begin in February, protesting segregated seating in a Woolworth's diner. In 2 months, the sit-in movement spreads to 54 cities in 9 states. Thurgood Marshall, National Counsel for the NAACP, warns against accepting token integration. 1963. The March on Washington is the largest civil rights demonstration to date. Martin Luther King Jr. delivers a speech entitled "I Have a Dream." 1967. National Theater of the Deaf is founded. 1968. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated on April 4th. 1969. Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children sues their state over poor conditions. 1970. Ed Roberts and his peers at Cowell, the UC Berkeley Health Center, form a group called the Rolling Quads. The Rolling Quads form the Disabled Students Program on the UC Berkeley campus. Wyatt v. Stickney court case in Alabama paves the way for deinstitutionalization across the country. 1971. The United Nations adopts the Declaration on the Rights of Mentally Retarded Persons. 1972. Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania rules that exclusionary provisions in Pennsylvania's compulsory school attendance laws are unconstitutional. Geraldo Rivera's TV report on the Willowbrook State School in Letchworth Village is aired to millions of viewers. 1972. The New York State Association for Retarded Citizens brings a class action suit against the state of New York, alleging severe violations at the Willowbrook State School and Hospital. Section 504, or Public Law 92603, is added to the Rehabilitation Act, forbidding employment discrimination against people with developmental disabilities in federally funded programs. 1972. The Center for Independent Living opens in Berkeley, California. England holds a national conference sponsored by the Spastic Society and organized by the Campaign for the Mentally Handicapped. 1973. Canada holds its first self-advocacy conference. 1974. Disabled Women's Coalition, founded at UC Berkeley by Susan Seigel and Deborah Kaplan. Self-advocates in Oregon and Washington State organized the first U.S. self-advocacy conference. Wyatt v. Adderholt. Federal court rules that Alabama's eugenic sterilization law is unconstitutional. 1975. The United Nations adopts a Declaration on the Rights of Disabled Persons. 1977. Activists take over the San Francisco offices of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to protest Secretary Joseph Califano's refusal to sign meaningful regulations for Section 504. The action became the longest sit-in of a federal building to date. The historic demonstrations were successful, and the 504 regulations were finally signed. 1978. The federal government agrees to fund independent living centers. 1980. Self-advocates in Minneapolis picket their sheltered workshop for a union election. 1980 to 83. Sears Roebuck and Company begins selling decoders for closed captioning for television. 1984. Voting accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act ensures that all polling places must be accessible. 1980s. Group homes become common in communities, providing a least restrictive environment for individuals with developmental disabilities. 1985. 19 states still have laws permitting the sterilization of persons with mental retardation. Mental Illness Bill of Rights Act expands coverage of protection and advocacy to cover mental illness. 1979. The Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, or DREDF, is founded in Berkeley, California. 1984. George Murray becomes the first wheelchair athlete to be featured on the Wheaties cereal box. 1985. The National Association of Psychiatric Survivors is founded. 1986. Toward Independence is published by the National Council of the Handicapped, now National Council on Disability, recommending creation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. 1987.